London, 9:47 p.m. The air smells of smoke and pepper spray. Crowds flood Trafalgar Square, waving flags, shouting prayers, shouting slurs. Police lines buckle, fire spreads, and within hours, the capital of Britain becomes a front line between two nations that live inside the same city. Across the world, the footage plays in silence. In Tehran, in Riyadh, in Ankara, leaders call it a war on faith. In Washington, it's called a breakdown of Western order. No one realizes that the riots of London will trigger the alliances, threats, and launches that lead, inevitably, to the night the sky burns over half the planet. It began as a protest, a familiar one, a cultural rally after a police incident outside a mosque in Birmingham, a night of speeches that was meant to end in peace. But by dawn, the footage told a different story. Police vehicles overturned, flags burned, chants echoing, "No justice, no nation." Within 48 hours, the unrest spread to Manchester, Leeds, and London. What made this different wasn't the scale. It was the split. For the first time in modern Britain, the nation divided cleanly along faith and identity. Mosques were torched in retaliation, churches defaced in return. Telegram channels filled with calls to defend our own. By the fifth night, central London was locked down. The Prime Minister called for calm. The opposition accused him of letting the country bleed from within. The BBC broadcast police footage showing armed groups forming inside the suburbs. "These are not protests anymore," said one analyst. "This is sectarian war in the heart of Britain." And the world was watching. In Tehran, state TV looped images of riot police striking Muslim youth. The Supreme Council declared, "If the West cannot protect believers, we will not remain silent." In Riyadh, clerics and ministers held emergency meetings. A joint statement followed, signed by Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, and Pakistan. An unprecedented move. The Islamic world stands united in defense of our people abroad. They called it a humanitarian coalition. Western intelligence called it the birth of a new alliance, the Crescent Pact. In Washington, the president stood before the press and drew a red line. Any interference by foreign powers in the internal affairs of our allies will be treated as aggression against the United States. Within hours, the Pentagon moved 2 carrier strike groups into the Mediterranean. NATO raised alert status to DEFCON 3 for the first time since 2001. The situation on the ground in Britain deteriorated by the hour. Mobile networks crashed. Refugee convoys formed around airports. Entire districts of London were placed under military curfew. "We are losing control," whispered one cabinet member to Sky News off record. "This is civil war with smartphones." The information war raged faster than bullets. Iranian state media streamed live coverage of British riot police clashing with protesters, branding it proof of persecution. American networks countered with footage of mosques stockpiling Molotovs and explosives. No one trusted anything, and everyone chose a side. By the 10th day, the world was split. The United States, Britain, France, and Israel rallied under the banner of Operation Iron Resolve, promising to defend Western sovereignty. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and Pakistan formalized the Crescent Pact, vowing mutual defense of Islamic nations and communities under threat. Russia declared strategic neutrality, but began moving nuclear-capable bombers to the Caspian region. China called for peace while quietly mobilizing its own missile forces in the Pacific. The first flashpoint came on day 12. A British patrol ship in the Persian Gulf intercepted an Iranian cargo vessel believed to be carrying humanitarian aid to Muslim communities in the UK. The Iranians refused inspection. The confrontation escalated. Warning shots were fired. Within 2 hours, both sides opened fire. The HMS Defender sank. So did the Iranian escort frigate Alborz. 168 sailors lost at sea. The headlines read, "The London riots have gone global." Within hours, air bases lit up from Cyprus to Bahrain. American bombers launched from Diego Garcia. Saudi jets scrambled north. In Europe, millions protested for peace. In Tehran, hundreds of thousands marched for vengeance. By the end of the week, intelligence analysts saw the pattern. This wasn't chaos anymore, it was choreography. Alliances were hardening into battle lines. A regional crisis had become a global countdown. And somewhere buried deep in command servers in Virginia and Tehran alike, algorithms were already calculating flight times. Not for sanctions, not for diplomacy, but for missiles. The streets of London were just the spark. The fire was now planetary. By the third week, the world was unrecognizable. The riots in London had stopped, not because of peace, but because there was nothing left to burn. Curfews silenced the streets, armored vehicles patrolled Westminster, and soldiers guarded mosques and churches side by side. Britain looked like a fortress under siege. But outside its borders, the real war was beginning. In Tehran, the Crescent Pact held its first joint press conference. Saudi and Iranian flags stood side by side for the first time in modern history. Their statement was chillingly unified. The Western powers have declared war on faith itself. We will answer together. Within 48 hours, Turkey closed the Bosporus to NATO ships, Egypt mobilized along the Suez Canal, and Pakistan announced that it would guarantee regional security, a phrase everyone knew was a thin veil for nuclear readiness. Satellite images showed convoys of launchers moving through desert roads under camouflage nets. In Washington, the response was immediate. Carrier Strike Group 12 moved into the eastern Mediterranean. B-2 Spirit bombers lifted from Missouri and flew toward bases in Qatar and Cyprus. The Pentagon didn't call it war. They called it containment operations. But in Tehran and Riyadh, it was interpreted as an invasion forming on the horizon. The European Union tried to mediate. France pushed for an emergency peace summit in Geneva, but no one came. Russia boycotted. China sent only an observer. The Crescent Pact called it a Western echo chamber. Diplomacy was dead. At 03:17 a.m., on the 23rd day of the crisis, a cyber attack crippled London's power grid. The blackout spread through Manchester and Glasgow, then across the Channel into Belgium and the Netherlands. The source, a worm traced back to servers in Qom, Iran's cyber command hub. Britain retaliated with a strike of its own, crashing government servers across the Middle East. Hospitals failed, airports froze, oil refineries exploded. The digital war became kinetic. U.S. drones struck suspected launch convoys outside Tehran. Satellite footage showed the fireballs live on every global news feed. Iran retaliated with cruise missiles on American bases in Bahrain and Kuwait. Saudi Arabia launched Operation Sword of the Prophet, sending over 200 aircraft toward Iraq, Jordan, and Israel. The entire Middle East became a battlefield. Then came the moment no one believed would happen. Turkey closed Incirlik Air Base, home to U.S. tactical nuclear weapons. American officers were detained. Ankara announced it was suspending cooperation with Western aggressors. Within hours, the Turkish president appeared on television beside Iran's supreme commander. The message was unmistakable. The Muslim world had united for the first time under one flag. In Moscow, the Kremlin smelled opportunity. Russian bombers began shadowing NATO patrols over the Baltic Sea. State media called it the return of multipolar justice. China, still silent, quietly mobilized its Pacific Fleet and announced support for international stability. Intelligence reports showed Chinese subs moving toward the Indian Ocean. Every superpower was now circling the fire. Inside the Pentagon, panic was giving way to exhaustion. Briefings came every hour, each worse than the last. London was in blackout, Paris paralyzed by protests, Berlin demanding withdrawal. And in the middle of it all, Washington was forced to decide, let the coalition collapse or escalate. At 5:04 a.m. Eastern Time, the president signed Directive 271, authorizing limited precision strikes on Iranian ballistic facilities and Saudi command centers. Minutes later, the skies above Tehran lit up. U.S. Tomahawk missiles screamed down from the Persian Gulf. In Riyadh, alarms wailed. Saudi air defense systems went active, intercepting several missiles, but not all. 2 hit. One cratered the communications ministry, another vaporized the foreign intelligence building. The world had crossed the point of no return. The next morning, Al Jazeera's broadcast played in total silence. Iranian clerics weeping beside the rubble of what had once been the country's missile command. The anchors didn't speak. They didn't have to. The images spoke for themselves. In London, the Prime Minister's voice cracked as he addressed the nation. "We did not start this war, but if our enemies bring it to us, we will finish it." Across the Middle East, millions took to the streets chanting for vengeance. In Tehran, state TV announced a message from the Supreme Council. The response will be unlike anything the world has ever seen. And in an underground base outside Isfahan, technicians opened a steel vault that hadn't been touched in 15 years. Inside it were 6 warheads, small, tactical, but very real. For the first time since 1945, the world prepared for nuclear war. By the 31st day, the war had slipped past human control. What began with riots in London was now a storm covering 3 continents. Airspace from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf was closed. Civilian flights grounded. Cities went dark as governments rationed electricity for the military. The world had entered the shadow phase of a nuclear war. Not yet the blast, but everything leading toward it. In Tehran, the Supreme Council convened in an underground bunker beneath the Alborz Mountains. Outside, the capital burned. American cruise missiles had hit fuel depots and command posts. Power stations flickered on backup diesel. Still, communications with Allied capitals continued. Riyadh, Islamabad, Ankara, Cairo. The encrypted transmission was simple. Phase 2 begins. Target the invaders, full retaliation authorized. Within an hour, the Crescent Pact struck back. At EO 3:12 GMT, Saudi aircraft launched more than 100 ballistic and cruise missiles toward U.S. bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. The American air defenses lit the night with interceptors, but dozens slipped through. The explosions turned the Gulf horizon into a sheet of orange. Footage of burning runways flooded social media before the Pentagon could issue a statement. Next came Pakistan's move. 2 tactical nuclear warheads, low-yield demonstration strikes, were detonated in the uninhabited desert along the border with India. Islamabad called it a warning shot. It was the first nuclear detonation on Earth in almost 80 years. Seismic sensors worldwide confirmed it within minutes. Markets collapsed. Air raid sirens sounded in New Delhi, Tel Aviv, and Istanbul. The United Nations called an emergency session, but half the delegates couldn't reach New York. The Security Council chamber sat half-lit, silent, waiting for a quorum that never arrived. In Washington, the president faced the decision no one wanted recorded in history. Advisors urged an immediate counterstrike. "If we don't respond, they'll think we've gone blind," said the defense secretary. But the Joint Chiefs warned that a nuclear exchange in the Middle East could ignite Russia and China next. The president's order was measured but grim. Target their command, not their cities. Keep it below the threshold, if that's still possible. At 06:45 GMT, 3 American B-2 Spirits crossed Iranian airspace at high altitude. Their payloads were bunker-buster bombs carrying conventional warheads, aimed at the suspected nuclear vaults outside Isfahan. The strikes were precise and catastrophic. One penetrated too deep. The shockwave ruptured a storage facility containing enriched uranium. The detonation released a mushroom of dust, fire, and radiation that reached the sky. The world didn't know yet if it had witnessed a nuclear blast or a conventional one gone wrong. But by the time confirmation came, panic had already taken over. Russia declared full nuclear alert. China's Eastern Command issued a defensive readiness notice. Israel scrambled its own deterrent aircraft over the Negev desert. Every major power now had fingers resting on launch keys. In Europe, protests turned to riots. Crowds demanded their governments withdraw from NATO. In Berlin, demonstrators stormed the Reichstag shouting, "Stop the war or we stop you." In Paris, soldiers guarded airports as tens of thousands tried to flee the continent. The most chilling development came 12 hours later. Iranian state television broadcast grainy footage. The supreme commander standing beside a missile on a desert launch pad. He read from a paper, voice trembling but clear. "To those who think we will surrender us, look east." Moments later, early warning satellites over the Indian Ocean picked up a launch. Analysts at U.S. Strategic Command stared at the trajectory. It wasn't aimed at Israel or Europe or even the Gulf. It was climbing too steeply, too fast. The coordinates pointed across the Pacific. "Where is it going?" someone whispered. Over the pole, said another. It's going for the U.S. mainland. The Pentagon scrambled interceptors. NATO radars came alive from Norway to Alaska. Anti-missile systems fired in sequence, one after another, forming a chain of light across the northern sky. At 07:12 GMT over the Bering Strait, a brilliant flash illuminated the clouds. The Iranian missile had been intercepted, but the detonation of its warhead, 120 kilometers above sea level, created an electromagnetic pulse that rippled across the northern hemisphere. In seconds, power grids failed from Vancouver to Chicago. Satellites blinked out. Air traffic control went blind. The United States was still standing, but deaf, blind, and dark. For the first time since 1945, humanity realized it was already in a nuclear war, only waiting for the next light in the sky to decide who would vanish first. The world entered silence. Not peace. Silence. The kind that follows when power grids die, when satellites stop talking, and when every leader in every bunker wonders if the next sound they hear will be the end of everything. Across the northern hemisphere, lights vanished. The Iranian high-altitude detonation had triggered a chain reaction that crippled power networks from Canada to Scandinavia. Planes fell from the sky. Stock markets disappeared in static. The internet fractured into islands of surviving servers. For the first time in modern history, the entire West was offline. In Washington, the president sat inside the Mount Weather bunker surrounded by maps drawn by candlelight. Communications with London were intermittent. Paris was dark. Berlin had gone silent entirely. The United States had survived the EMP but not untouched. Power plants offline, missile systems rebooting manually, thousands dead from crashes and fires. Military command demanded retaliation. "We know where it came from. End it," said the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But intelligence painted a darker picture. Russia had moved into full readiness, China's eastern bases were powered up, and Pakistan had vanished from radar contact. The chain was loaded. One strike anywhere would trigger launches everywhere. Meanwhile, in Tehran, radiation alarms wailed from the Isfahan region. What was left of the Supreme Council met by flashlight. Their own missile units were gone. Communications to Riyadh and Ankara were cut by the EMP. No one knew which allies were alive, which had already been erased. Yet their statement was unwavering. "If America strikes again, we will burn together." The United Nations met for the final time. Not in New York, but in Geneva, powered by emergency generators. Delegates from 57 nations crowded into a half-lit hall. The Secretary General spoke through tears. "If another nuclear weapon is launched, we lose everything. The oceans will boil, the skies will fall silent. End this now." No one applauded. Some prayed, others just stared at their phones waiting for news that would never refresh. Then came the transmission. Short, encrypted, unmistakably authentic. It originated from a submarine in the North Atlantic, USS Wyoming, an Ohio-class ballistic missile sub. The message was only 6 words long. "Command broken. Launch protocol initiated manually." In the Pentagon, alarms erupted. No one knew if it was rogue, damaged, or responding to false data from the dead satellites. The president ordered the impossible. Contact the boat. Disable it. But no one could. The satellite links were gone. HF radios jammed. All that existed between the world and extinction was 6 words and 32 missiles underwater. For 19 minutes, the fate of humanity hung on one crew. Somewhere in the blackness under the Atlantic, men argued by flashlight whether the apocalypse had already begun above them. One commander whispered, "If we've already been hit, what difference does it make?" Another younger officer answered, "Because if we haven't, it still matters." At 07:52 GMT, sonar stations detected a single-release capsule. One missile, but not a barrage. It broke surface, fire trailing into the dark clouds above the ocean. For 30 seconds, radar painted its path across dead skies. And then, it veered. Self-destruct. The world didn't end, but it didn't heal either. Over the next 48 hours, ceasefire messages passed through surviving embassies. The Crescent Pact dissolved. Its capitals were smoking ruins. NATO fractured, its unity gone. The United States survived but shattered. No grid, no economy, no allies left to call. The war never got an official name. Historians later called it the 31-Day War, though most agreed it lasted much longer, in fear and fallout, in the silence that followed. Months later, satellites came back online. The first image broadcast worldwide showed the Earth from orbit. Dark hemispheres, faint orange glows where cities once were, and a thin blue line still circling the planet. Humanity had not died, but the age of nations had. The new world was smaller, quieter, more fragile. And somewhere under a fractured sky, a child asked her mother what the world used to sound like before the fire. The answer was the same one written on every monument that rose afterward, from Washington to Tehran. We thought we were defending our people. We ended up destroying the future. Disclaimer: this is a fictional simulation. It does not depict real events or endorse violence. It's an exploration of how modern miscommunication, nationalism, and technology could drive the world toward irreversible catastrophe.